Prepping for this deep dive into the Marie Noah case, I kept coming back to this question. How did she fool everyone for so long?
Right.
We're talking about a woman convicted of murdering 8 of her 10 children
Yeah.
in Philadelphia.
It's a story that gets under your skin.
Doesn't it?
It really does.
And you're right, the deception, it's a key piece of this.
Yeah, key part of this whole puzzle.
For decades.
Decades, these deaths were just attributed to SIDS.
Yeah, sudden infant death syndrome.
But the sheer number in one family,
yeah,
statistically speaking,
right,
incredibly rare.
Exactly. And we're looking at excerpts from Marie Noah's Wikipedia page.
Okay.
Articles about the case. References to a few books that really dug deep.
Okay.
And what's wild is this all happened between 1949 and 1968.
Right.
A time when medical understanding of SIDS and even child abuse was very different.
Yeah, very different. This case exposes how much societal and scientific contexts can shape our perceptions.
Yeah.
Back then, the image of a grieving mother fit a certain narrative.
Right.
People didn't necessarily have the tools or the inclination to look beyond that.
Right. It's like everyone was looking at a puzzle, but they were missing crucial pieces. So let's try to put those pieces together.
Yeah.
Starting with the timeline of the Noah family's tragic history.
Okay.
It's tough to hear, but it's essential
Yeah.
to understanding the complexities.
I agree. The chronology is like a map.
Yeah.
Helping us spot any patterns, any red flags that might have been missed at the time.
Okay, so Marie and Arthur Noah had 10 children.
10 children.
2 of the deaths were ultimately considered natural.
Okay.
Letitia was stillborn due to an umbilical cord knot.
Right.
And Teresa passed away in the hospital from what was listed as a bleeding disorder.
Tragic, of course.
Yeah.
But those 2 deaths alone wouldn't necessarily raise suspicion.
Right.
It's the other 8 that make this case so unsettling.
And it starts with Richard Allen Noe,
Okay.
born March 7, 1949, died just a month later.
A month later.
Then there's Elizabeth Mary Noe,
Okay.
born September 8, 1950, died February 17, 1951.
51.
Jacqueline Noe,
Okay.
born April 23, 1952,
52.
lived only 10 days.
10 days.
Then there's Arthur Noe Jr.,
Okay.
born April 23, 1955,
55.
who died after just 5 days.
Wow.
The pattern continues heartbreakingly.
Yeah.
Constance Noe, born February 24th, 1958, died less than a month later.
Less than a month later.
Mary Lee Noe, born June 19, 1962,
Okay.
died on January 4, 1963.
63.
And finally, Catherine Ellen Noe, born December 3, 1964,
64.
died on February 24, 1966.
8 children.
8 children.
All gone before they reached 14 months old.
It's almost impossible to grasp that kind of loss.
Yeah.
But stepping back from the emotional impact for a moment,
Okay.
what do you see when you look at this timeline?
What's striking is the sheer density of these deaths within a relatively short time frame.
Yeah.
With our current knowledge of SIDS, the statistical probability of this happening in one family
Right.
is astronomically low.
So right away, the timeline itself raises serious questions.
Yeah.
Now, given this tragic sequence of events, let's delve into Marie Noah's background.
Okay.
We know she was born in 1928 in Philadelphia
28.
and had a really difficult upbringing.
Right.
Could there be a connection?
Her Wikipedia page mentions she contracted scarlet fever at age 5
Okay.
and later attributed learning difficulties to that illness.
Oh, wow.
She dropped out of school in her early teens to work and help raise a niece who was being raised as her sister.
Wow. Dropping out of school that young to help raise a child.
Yeah.
That's a lot of responsibility for a teenager.
Mm-hmm.
I can only imagine the kind of pressure that would put on someone.
Absolutely. Well, we can't draw direct lines between her difficult upbringing and her later actions.
Right.
Those early experiences undoubtedly shaped her.
Right.
It makes you wonder about the potential psychological impact, the coping mechanisms she might have developed.
And here's where things get even more complicated.
Okay.
Instead of being investigated, Marie Noah was initially portrayed as a grieving mother,
Mm-hmm.
a victim of fate.
Yeah.
There's this 1963 Life magazine article
Oh,
that really illustrates how effectively she was able to manage public perception.
That article titled Sudden Death
Okay.
used pseudonyms and painted a sanitized, almost romanticized version of their story.
Wow.
There were photos of Marie Noah looking distraught,
Okay.
the caption emphasizing her grief.
Right.
It presented the Noahs as this loving couple enduring unimaginable loss.
Right.
a narrative that resonated with readers.
It's shocking to think that this narrative was widely accepted,
Right.
especially considering the number of deaths.
It speaks to the power of media narratives and societal expectations.
Yeah.
A grieving mother was a figure people didn't want to scrutinize,
Right.
even when there might have been reason to question the circumstances.
It's almost like a collective blind spot,
Right.
fueled by societal norms of the time.
Yeah,
But thankfully, perceptions eventually started to shift.
right. Two key events really changed the course of this case.
Okay.
The first was the 1997 book,
Okay.
The Death of Innocence,
Okay.
which focused on the case of Juanetta Hoyt.
Okay.
She was a woman who had also been suspected of murdering her children,
Okay.
but had initially evaded justice.
So this book wasn't directly about Marino,
Right.
but it planted a seed of doubt, right?
Exactly. The book brought attention to Munchausen syndrome by proxy,
Right.
a mental health condition where a caregiver, often a mother,
Mm-hmm.
fabricates or induces illness in a dependent,
Okay.
usually a child,
Right.
to gain attention and sympathy.
Right.
It highlighted the possibility that this could be a factor in cases like Noah's,
Okay.
something that might have been overlooked before.
That's a chilling thought, and it raises the question,
Yeah.
could Munchausen syndrome by proxy have manifested in nosy behavior?
Mm-hmm.
Is there any indication of that in the sources we've got?
That's a question that deserves closer examination.
Yeah.
Remember, one of the key characteristics of Munchausen syndrome by proxy is the caregiver's intense need for attention and sympathy.
Okay.
They might exaggerate symptoms, fabricate illnesses,
Right.
or even actively induce sickness in their child.
And they often seem overly attentive and concerned, further deflecting suspicion, right?
Exactly. They become the hero in a tragic narrative,
Mm-hmm.
garnering support and validation from those around them.
Right.
And in a time when medical understanding of such conditions was limited,
Yeah.
it's easy to see how this could go unnoticed.
So even if there were subtle signs, they might have been dismissed or misinterpreted.
Hmm.
It's almost like a perfect disguise, hiding abuse in plain sight.
Precisely. And that's what makes Munchausen syndrome by proxy so insidious.
Right.
It's often masked by a facade of concern and devotion,
Right.
making it incredibly difficult to detect.
But even with this new awareness of Munchausen syndrome by proxy,
Hmm.
the no case remained closed.
Right.
What was the catalyst that finally brought it back into the spotlight?
It was investigative journalist Stephen Fried's 1998 article in Philadelphia Magazine
Okay.
titled Cradle to Grave.
Okay.
He directly challenged the accepted narrative,
Right.
uncovering inconsistencies and raising serious doubts about the sin's explanation.
Right.
He didn't just rehash the old story.
Yeah.
He dug deeper, interviewed experts, analyzed the evidence,
Okay.
and presented a compelling case for reinvestigation.
Talk about the power of good journalism.
Right.
One article and suddenly decades of accepted truth are called into question.
Mm-hmm.
What specifically did Fried uncover that was so compelling?
He meticulously reviewed medical records,
Okay.
interviewed medical professionals,
Right.
and spoke with people who knew the Noes personally.
Okay.
He uncovered discrepancies in Marie Noes' accounts of the deaths,
Mm-hmm.
pointed out unusual patterns in the timing and circumstances,
Okay.
and consulted with experts who found the number of deaths statistically improbable.
Yeah.
He essentially built a case that was impossible to ignore.
That takes serious guts going up against an established narrative like that.
Right.
And thankfully, Freak's work paid off.
It did. His article, combined with the growing awareness of Munchausen syndrome by proxy,
Right.
created enough momentum for the police to reopen the case.
Okay.
And what happened next was a turning point, but one shrouded in a whole new layer of mystery. When the police confronted Marie Noe with this new investigation, with experts questioning the SI's rulings, and with the shadow of Munchausen syndrome by proxy looming, she did something unexpected. She confessed.
Confessed. But for decades, she'd maintained her innocence. What led to this sudden change of heart? Was it the weight of the evidence, the fear of a trial, or something else entirely?
It's hard to say for certain police interrogation tactics, the psychological pressure of the renewed scrutiny. Those could have played a role. But what makes this confession even more perplexing is that she only admitted to suffocating 4 of her children.
Wait, she confessed to some, but not all. That doesn't make sense. Was it a strategy to minimize her culpability, a genuine memory lapse, or something more psychologically complex?
It's a detail that continues to baffle those who have studied this case. Some experts suggest it could be a manifestation of dissociative amnesia, where traumatic memories are blocked out as a coping mechanism. Others speculate it might have been a calculated attempt to control the narrative, to present herself as a partially reformed individual struggling with a fragmented memory.
So even in her confession, there's this element of manipulation, this blurring of truth and deception. It's like she's still trying to maintain some semblance of control over how she's perceived.
Exactly. It speaks to the deeply ingrained patterns of behavior we've been discussing. Even when confronted with overwhelming evidence, those deeply rooted coping mechanisms, those ways of manipulating perception can remain incredibly powerful.
Okay, so let's talk about the legal aftermath of this partial confession. 8 counts of second-degree murder. You'd think that would mean a substantial prison sentence.
Logically, yes. But the reality of the legal system, especially with cases this complex and this old, isn't always straightforward. Remember, this was a case from decades past. Evidence might have been degraded. Witnesses' memories might have been unreliable. And securing a conviction for all 8 deaths, proving intent beyond a reasonable doubt, would have been incredibly challenging.
So there was a risk that she could have been acquitted, or at least had some charges dismissed.
Exactly, and that's where plea deals come into play. The prosecution likely saw this as a way to guarantee some measure of justice, assure conviction, even if it meant accepting a seemingly lighter sentence. It's a compromise that often leaves people feeling conflicted.
It certainly does. In this case, the plea deal resulted in a sentence of 20 years of probation with the first 5 years under house arrest for killing 8 of her own children. That feels profoundly inadequate.
I understand that reaction. It's hard to reconcile such a horrific crime with what seems like a lenient punishment. But we also have to consider that Noah was elderly at the time of her conviction, and that she had confessed, albeit partially, which likely played a role in the sentencing.
It's still difficult to grapple with, but you mentioned something earlier that I want to circle back to. Her age at the time of the crimes, she was relatively young when these deaths began, right? In her early 20s, if I remember correctly.
You're right, and that brings us to the psychological evaluation that was conducted as part of her plea deal. Remember, she was diagnosed with a mixed personality disorder exhibiting traits from a range of conditions. This diagnosis is crucial for trying to understand as best we can the potential motivations behind her actions.
Okay, break that down for me. What does a mixed personality disorder mean in this context? It sounds incredibly complicated.
It is. Imagine a personality as a mosaic made up of different tiles, each representing a particular trait or tendency. In a mixed personality disorder, those tiles are jumbled, creating a complex and often contradictory picture. The report specifically identified avoidant-dependent, narcissistic, histrionic, borderline paranoid, and even antisocial features in Marie Noé's personality.
That's a lot to unpack. How did they think these specific traits might have contributed to her actions? Could those traits in some way help explain this horrific pattern of behavior?
It's essential to remember that a diagnosis doesn't excuse her actions. It offers a framework for understanding, not a justification. But let's consider a few of those traits and how they might have played a role. For example, her dependent personality might have made her crave attention and sympathy, which could have manifested in a need to be seen as the grieving mother, the one deserving of care and support.
That makes sense. It's like the attention and validation she received for being a grieving mother became a sort of twisted reward fueling the cycle of abuse.
It's a plausible interpretation, but there's more to it. Her narcissistic traits might have contributed to a distorted sense of reality and a lack of empathy, making it easier for her to detach from the consequences of her actions, to rationalize her behavior.
So she might have seen her children as extensions of herself, existing primarily to fulfill her needs rather than as individuals with their own rights and needs.
That's one way to look at it. And then there are the antisocial features, which could manifest as a disregard for social norms and a lack of remorse. It's a complex web of potential motivations, all intertwined with these varying personality traits.
It's like each trait adds another layer to the puzzle, making it even more difficult to decipher. But what about the avoidant personality you mentioned? How might that have played a role?
Individuals with avoidant personalities tend to be extremely sensitive to criticism and rejection. They often have difficulty forming close relationships and go to great lengths to avoid situations where they might be judged or disapproved of.
So in the context of this case, could that have influenced her interactions with doctors or investigators?
Absolutely. It's possible that she felt overwhelmed by the scrutiny, the questioning, and retreated into herself as a way of coping. This avoidance could have contributed to her seemingly inconsistent accounts and her inability to fully explain her actions.
So the avoidant tendencies might have been a defense mechanism, a way of shielding herself from the emotional weight of her actions and the potential consequences.
It's a plausible explanation, and it highlights the complexities of this case. We're not dealing with a single straightforward motive, but rather a confluence of factors, a mix of personality traits, environmental pressures, and perhaps even biological predispositions.
It's a lot to process, especially considering the gravity of the crimes and the devastating loss of 8 young lives.
It is. The Marie Noe case is a Pandora's box of ethical, medical, and psychological complexities. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the limits of our understanding. And even with all the information we have, there are still so many unanswered questions.
It's overwhelming, isn't it? We
Yeah.
spent all this time digging into the details, the timeline, the psychology,
Yeah.
and yet it feels like we're no closer to truly understanding what drove Marie Noe to commit these horrific acts.
And that's the unsettling truth about this case, and many cases like it.
Yeah,
We can analyze the evidence, explore potential motivations, piece together a narrative,
right.
but ultimately we may never fully grasp the darkness that can reside within the human heart.
It's almost as if there's a fundamental limit to what we can comprehend about the depths of human cruelty.
Right.
But even if we can't fully understand the why,
Yeah.
I think it's important to consider the what now.
Mm-hmm.
What are the lasting impacts of this case?
Yeah.
How has it changed our understanding of SIDS and child abuse?
The Marie Noe case,
Right.
along with several other high-profile cases involving multiple infant deaths within a family,
Hmm.
forced a paradigm shift in how we approach infant mortality.
Okay.
It prompted the medical community to critically re-examine the diagnosis of SIDS,
Right.
leading to more rigorous investigations, a deeper understanding of risk factors,
Okay.
and greater emphasis on parental education and support.
So in a way, these tragic deaths have helped save other children's lives by prompting a more cautious and informed approach.
Precisely. It's a bittersweet legacy,
Yeah.
but a crucial one.
The Noe case also highlighted the insidious nature of Munchausen syndrome by proxy,
Right.
raising awareness among medical professionals, social workers, and law enforcement.
Yeah.
This increased awareness has undoubtedly led to earlier detection and intervention in other cases, potentially preventing further harm.
Exactly.
That's a glimmer of hope in an otherwise incredibly dark story.
Mm-hmm.
It's a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable tragedy, there's always the possibility of learning, of growing,
Right.
of using that knowledge to protect others.
I agree. And it underscores the importance of vigilance,
Mm-hmm.
of questioning assumptions,
Right.
and of speaking up when something doesn't feel right.
Yeah.
We can't afford to be complacent, especially when it comes to the safety and well-being of children.
Well said. You know, as we've been discussing this case, I keep thinking about all the missed opportunities for intervention.
Yeah.
Could more have been done to prevent these tragedies?
It's a question that haunts many who study this case.
Yeah.
With what we know now about child abuse, postpartum mental health, and Munchausen syndrome by proxy,
Right.
it's tempting to believe that someone somewhere could have intervened.
But hindsight is always 20/20, right?
Right.
Back then, the awareness simply wasn't there.
Right?
And as we discussed earlier, the societal expectations surrounding motherhood likely played a role in silencing any doubts or suspicions.
Absolutely. And that's why cases like this are so important to revisit.
Yeah.
They serve as stark reminders of how far we've come in terms of understanding and addressing child abuse, but also how much further we need to go.
Right.
We need to continue to challenge assumptions, to advocate for vulnerable populations, and to ensure that support systems are in place for families struggling with mental health issues or other challenges.
It's a heavy responsibility,
Mm-hmm.
but a vital one.
It is.
So as we wrap up this deep dive,
Okay.
what's the one takeaway you hope listeners will hold on to? What's the most important thing we can learn from the unsettling story of Marino?
For me, it's the reminder that truth can be elusive
Right.
and justice can be delayed.
Mm-hmm.
We must be critical thinkers,
Yes.
always questioning assumptions, and recognizing that even the most seemingly perfect facades can conceal unimaginable darkness.
Wow.
The Marie Noe case is a story that lingers,
Yeah.
challenging us to confront our own biases and strive for a world where such tragedies are not just understood,
Right.
but prevented.
It's a powerful message and one that resonates deeply.
It is.
And for those of you listening, if this deep dive has left you wanting to explore further, I encourage you to check out the books and articles we've referenced.
Mm-hmm.
There's so much more to uncover about this complex and disturbing case.
Yeah.
But be warned, it's a journey into the heart of human darkness.
Right.
And it's not an easy one to take, a margin or a consentative recording.